Ethan Blackwood had never believed in love. To him, it was nothing more than a weakness, an unnecessary distraction that led only to pain and chaos. The world saw him as a ruthless billionaire, a man who had built his empire from the ground up. He controlled entire industries, bought failing companies, and turned them into gold. Every business decision he made was precise, calculated, and executed with machine-like efficiency. His life thrived on power and logic, not emotions. Emotions, in his view, were nothing but a liability. They clouded judgment, created vulnerabilities, and left people open to hurt. He had learned this the hard way. His father had been a fool for love, chasing after a woman who never truly cared for him. She strung him along, drained him emotionally, and then abandoned him to pursue her own selfish interests. When she finally walked away, taking whatever dignity he had left, Ethan's father was reduced to a shell of a man, broken, drowning in regret. And then there was his mother. Her departure had left an even deeper wound in Ethan's heart. She had walked out when he was just 8 years old, leaving without a single goodbye. No explanations, no justifications, just an empty space where a mother's love should have been. She had chosen something or someone else over her own son, leaving him with a profound sense of abandonment that followed him into adulthood. As a child, Ethan had struggled to understand it. Why did people risk everything for something as fleeting and unreliable as love? The answer eluded him, but the lesson was crystal clear. Love made people weak. Love made them vulnerable. And Ethan had sworn to himself that he would never, ever be weak. At 34, Ethan had everything a man could want: a billion-dollar empire, luxury cars, a private jet, and an army of people ready to obey his every command. But he also had rules that protected him, rules that ensured he would never make the same mistakes his parents had made. No attachments, no distractions, no love. These weren't just guidelines. They were laws etched into the very fabric of his existence. To Ethan, they were the pillars upon which his empire rested, safeguarding him from the chaos and unpredictability of emotions. But then she walked into his life. Sophie Carter had no interest in billionaires. To her, they were symbols of excess and indulgence, men who lived in worlds so far removed from reality that their feet barely touched the ground. She didn't envy them, nor did she dream of being swept away by one. Her life was simple, her dreams even simpler. All she wanted was to keep her small art gallery running, to bring beauty into the world, and to make enough money to pay rent. For Sophie, success wasn't measured in zeros on a bank account. It was found in the quiet satisfaction of seeing someone connect with a piece of art, in the way a painting could stir emotions or tell stories without uttering a single word. So, when Ethan Blackwood entered her gallery one evening, she didn't immediately notice him. He wasn't the kind of man who blended into the background, but Sophie was too preoccupied with rearranging a display to pay attention. The gallery was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of overhead lights that highlighted the vibrant colors and textures of the paintings around her. It was a sanctuary, a place where chaos faded and creativity thrived. She liked it that way. One evening, Ethan Blackwood walked into Sophie's gallery, but she didn't notice him right away. He wasn't the kind of man who went unnoticed, but Sophie was too busy arranging a display to look up. The gallery was quiet, filled with the soft glow of overhead lights that made the colors and textures of the paintings stand out. It was a peaceful place where all noise and chaos disappeared and creativity came to life. Sophie liked it that way. Then his voice broke the silence, deep and strong, cutting through the stillness like a sharp blade. "This place is different." Sophie turned around, her eyebrows pulling together at the interruption. And then she saw him. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He stood there with the confidence of someone who didn't just own the room, but the entire building. His suit was perfect, fitting him like it had been made just for him, and everything about him radiated power. He was the kind of man who could make people stop and stare, the kind women whispered about in quiet conversations. But what caught Sophie's attention the most were his eyes, gray, cold, and distant. Those weren't the eyes of a man who appreciated art. They were the eyes of someone used to control, someone who always got what he wanted, without question. Crossing her arms over her chest, Sophie put up an invisible wall between them. "Different good or different bad?" she asked. Her voice edged with doubt. He looked at her, studying her as if trying to figure something out. Most people didn't hold his gaze. They either feared him or respected his power too much. But Sophie didn't look away. She met his eyes without hesitation, refusing to let him intimidate her. After a moment, he finally spoke. "Good," he said, his voice steady and certain. Sophie lifted an eyebrow, unconvinced. "You don't sound sure." The corner of his mouth twitched slightly, almost like a smile, but not quite. It was hard to tell if it was amusement or curiosity. "I don't say things I don't mean," he answered. Something about the way he looked at her made warmth spread through her, a feeling she couldn't quite name. But she quickly pushed it aside. She had met men like him before, powerful, untouchable, completely out of place in her world. They came into her gallery now and then, interested in art for its status or to impress someone. But they never stayed long, and they never truly understood the meaning behind the work she displayed. This man was no different. She told herself that firmly. "Are you here to buy something?" she asked, still keeping her arms crossed. Her tone was polite but firm, making it clear that she wasn't going to be easily impressed or swayed. For a moment, he didn't answer. His eyes moved slowly around the gallery, scanning the paintings until they landed on one in particular. Without hesitation, he pointed at it. "That one." Sophie blinked, surprised. "You want to buy the Storm? That's one of my personal pieces." "I'll pay double," he said, his voice calm and sure, as if money didn't matter to him at all. It was a simple statement, one that reminded her just how different his world was from hers. Sophie's jaw tightened, frustration rising inside her. That painting wasn't just a piece of art, it was a part of her. Every brushstroke held emotion, capturing the wild and powerful energy of nature. It meant something to her. And even though she needed the money to keep her gallery open, some things weren't for sale, not even for twice their price. "It's not for sale," she said firmly, looking him straight in the eye. Ethan Blackwood wasn't used to hearing the word no. In his world, problems were meant to be solved, challenges defeated, and whatever he wanted, he got. People always did what he asked, whether because they feared him, respected him, or were simply amazed by his power. But now, here was this woman, standing in her small gallery, calmly telling him no, as if his power didn't matter at all. Surprisingly, he didn't feel angry. Instead, he felt something he didn't expect: curiosity. There was a fire in her eyes, a quiet strength that caught his attention. She didn't look afraid, didn't try to change her answer, and didn't try to please him. If anything, she looked amused that he was even trying to act like he was in charge. As he studied her, really looked at her, he realized something strange. He didn't want to scare her. He wanted to understand her. That thought bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Understanding someone meant letting them see past the image he carefully showed the world. It meant letting down his guard, which was risky. Vulnerability was dangerous. It opened doors that should stay closed and revealed weaknesses that could be used against him. But here he was, standing in a small art gallery, unable to look away from a woman who refused to follow his rules. Sophie watched him closely, noticing the small change in his expression. Even though he was rich and powerful, at that moment he looked human, almost unsure, maybe even curious. It made him seem less scary, more like a real person. But she quickly reminded herself not to let her guard down. Men like Ethan Blackwood were unpredictable, and she had learned the hard way that trust was not something to give easily. "You're not going to accept no as an answer, are you?" she asked, her voice calm but careful. He tilted his head slightly, thinking about her question. "Not usually," he said honestly, "but I'm starting to think you're different from everyone else." Sophie smirked, unable to hold back a quick reply. "Well, that makes two of us." For the first time since he walked into the gallery, Ethan felt a real smile trying to form. It was small, barely there, but it happened. And in that moment, Sophie realized something important. Ethan Blackwood, despite his perfect appearance and strong personality, was not unbreakable. Under all his confidence and control, there was a man who, in some ways, was just as unsure as anyone else. The thought made her pause. Maybe there was more to him than what she first saw, or maybe she was just overthinking a random meeting. Either way, one thing was clear. Ethan Blackwood had stepped into her world, and there was no going back. Long after he left the gallery, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Sophie Carter. Her image stayed in his mind, refusing to disappear, like a tiny splinter stuck under his skin. He didn't understand it, couldn't figure out why she had such an effect on him. She wasn't the kind of woman he usually noticed. She didn't fit into any of the groups he mentally placed people in: powerful business partners, useful contacts, or temporary distractions. No, Sophie was something else entirely. She was strong, stubborn, and completely uninterested in his money or his name. What unsettled him the most was how she looked at him, not with admiration or fear, but with sharp, knowing eyes that seemed to see right through the walls he had carefully built around himself. A slow smile appeared on his lips, a natural reaction to her defiance. "You're stubborn," he said, his voice carrying both frustration and admiration. "And you're arrogant," she replied instantly, lifting her chin in defiance. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle and leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Most people find that intimidating." She met his eyes without hesitation. "I'm not most people." For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something stir inside him, something warm and unfamiliar. It wasn't just interest, it was curiosity, amusement, and yes, attraction. Sophie was different from anyone he had ever met. She didn't obey his commands, didn't flinch under his intense gaze. In fact, she seemed to enjoy challenging him, resisting every attempt he made to assert control. And while part of him found it frustrating, another part, a part he tried hard to ignore, was fascinated by her. "I'll make you a deal," he said after a brief pause, his voice low and serious. "Have dinner with me. If you still hate me afterward, I'll leave your gallery alone." Sophie hesitated, her anger shifting into suspicion. Everything about him screamed danger. He was a billionaire, a powerful man in a world where she was just trying to make a living. Having dinner with him felt like walking into a lion's den, fully aware of the risks. Yet despite her instincts telling her to stay away, something inside her whispered, "Just once. Just this once. Take a risk. See what's behind that cold, controlled exterior." "Fine," she said at last, her voice steady but cautious. "One dinner, but don't expect me to fall at your feet." Ethan's smile widened, and for the first time there was genuine amusement in his gray eyes. "I wouldn't dream of it." In the days leading up to their dinner, both of them felt the anticipation, though neither would admit it. Ethan found himself distracted, replaying their conversation in his mind, wondering what it was about Sophie that had unsettled him. Was it her refusal to be intimidated? Her deep love for her work? Or was it simply the fact that she embodied everything he had spent his life avoiding: chaos, unpredictability, emotions? Whatever the reason, it wouldn't leave his mind. It kept him awake at night and pulled his attention away from work during the day. He told himself it was just curiosity, nothing more. One dinner would be enough to satisfy it. After that, he could return to his carefully planned life and leave Sophie Carter behind. Sophie, on the other hand, struggled with her own doubts. She knew saying yes to dinner was risky and could easily backfire. Ethan Blackwood wasn't the kind of man who handled rejection well, and she worried that agreeing to his invitation would only encourage him. But there was something about him that she couldn't ignore, something beyond his wealth and power. Beneath his polished and controlled appearance, she caught glimpses of vulnerability, signs of a man torn between who he was and who he wanted to be. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ethan Blackwood than what the world saw. And despite her better judgment, she felt an irresistible pull to find out what that was. When the evening finally arrived, they met at an expensive restaurant with a view of the city skyline. The setting was elegant, almost too perfect, with soft lighting and a view that stretched for miles. Ethan arrived first, dressed in a perfectly fitted suit that highlighted his broad shoulders and strong presence. But when Sophie walked in, every eye in the room turned to her, including his. She wore a simple but stunning dress, its deep emerald color matching her fiery red hair and green eyes. She didn't try to impress anyone or change herself to fit in. She was completely herself, and for a moment, Ethan was at a loss for words. Their conversation started carefully, both of them testing the waters before going deeper. Sophie asked questions that surprised him, questions about his childhood, his motivations, and his fears. Ethan, in return, asked about her passions, learning about her love for art and her dreams of making a difference in the world. As the night went on, the walls between them slowly came down, piece by piece, until they found themselves laughing, sharing stories, and connecting in a way neither had expected. By the end of the evening, Ethan realized something important. Sophie wasn't just a distraction or a challenge. She was a mirror, showing him parts of himself he had ignored for years. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to look away. Ethan had rules, rules that kept him safe, rules that made sure he never made the same mistakes his parents had made. No attachments, no distractions, no love. These weren't just suggestions, they were laws deeply rooted in his way of living. To Ethan, these rules were the foundation of his empire, protecting him from the chaos and uncertainty of emotions. He followed them like sacred commandments, never questioning their control over his life. They kept him strong, guarded, and safe from the kind of pain that could completely destroy a person. But Sophie Carter had broken all his rules. She hadn't meant to. Not on purpose, at least. She wasn't a manipulator or a woman trying to play games. In fact, she was the opposite. Honest, straightforward, and fiercely independent. And yet, without even trying, she had taken apart every wall Ethan had built around himself. Just being near her was enough to throw off the careful balance of his life. The way she challenged him, questioned him, and looked at him, it all felt like an attack on the fortress he had spent years building. And yet, instead of running away or closing himself off, Ethan felt himself being pulled toward her, like a moth drawn to a flame. And it scared him. Ethan Blackwood was not a man who feared anything. He had built his empire on control, on careful calculations and unshakable certainty. He made decisions with precision, never letting emotions cloud his judgment. But Sophie Carter was different. She didn't fit neatly into any category, didn't follow the rules he had spent his life enforcing. And the more time he spent with her, the more she unraveled him, thread by thread. Days turned into weeks, and before he knew it, she had become a part of his world. It wasn't just that she was around, it was that her presence had started to fill the empty spaces he hadn't even realized existed. She was at his penthouse, teasing him about his cold, colorless furniture, laughing as she threatened to sneak in bright, mismatched cushions just to make him suffer. She was at his office, walking in with a casual confidence that left his employees stunned, dropping off coffee because she happened to be nearby, even though he knew full well she had gone out of her way to bring it to him. She was at his side at events, challenging his views in ways no one else dared, making him see the world through a lens far different from the cold, strategic one he had always relied on. She was everywhere, and he didn't hate it. That was the problem. He was supposed to hate it. He was supposed to push her away, to see her as a disruption, an unpredictable force threatening the structure he had carefully built for himself. But instead, he found himself reaching for her without thinking, watching for her messages even when he was buried in work, craving her presence like a man deprived of oxygen. But love was never part of the plan. It couldn't be. Love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was a weakness he had sworn never to allow himself. Love meant risk, meant opening doors he had locked shut a long time ago. He had seen firsthand what love could do, how it could break people, how it could leave them shattered beyond repair. He had promised himself he would never fall victim to it. And yet, here he was. One night, as they lay together, tangled in the sheets, Sophie traced a slow, thoughtful finger over his chest. Her touch was soft, absent-minded, but it sent a shiver through him nonetheless. The room was quiet, the only sound their steady breaths in the dim light. "What happens now, Ethan?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled, staring at the ceiling as if the answer could be found somewhere in its smooth, unmarked surface. "I don't know." Sophie shifted, propping herself up on her elbow so she could see his face. Her green eyes searched his, looking for something, an answer, a reassurance, a truth he wasn't ready to give. "You always know," she murmured, studying him. His jaw tightened. That was the thing about Sophie. She saw through him too easily. Where others accepted his authority, she questioned it. Where others feared him, she challenged him. "Not with you," he admitted, the words rough, unsteady. Something flickered in her eyes. Hope, fear, a mix of both. He knew she was waiting for something, waiting for him to cross a line he had refused to even approach. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked softly. It was such a simple question, and yet it held the weight of something far greater. It wasn't just about that night, it was about everything. About what they had become. About what they could be. For the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwood didn't have an answer. and that terrified him more than anything else ever had. His grip didn't loosen, not even slightly. He held her as if letting go would mean losing everything that mattered. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Not this time." The weight of those words settled between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan had never said anything like that before, not to anyone. He had never allowed himself to need someone, to want them beyond reason. But with Sophie, it was different. She had become a part of him in a way he couldn't deny, a force he couldn't fight. In that moment, Ethan made a silent vow, to himself, to Sophie, and to the future they would build together. No matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he would fight for her. He would protect their love, nurture it, and ensure that nothing, not the world's judgment, not his own fears, would ever come between them again. Because for the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwood understood what it truly meant to live, and he owed it all to her. Ethan had spent years building walls around his heart, convinced that love was a weakness, an illusion that only led to pain. But when Sophie walked away that night, he realized something that shook him to his core. His walls had already crumbled. She had knocked them down piece by piece without even trying, and now, standing in the ruins, he saw the truth. Without her, his penthouse felt empty. The space that had once been his sanctuary now felt cold and lifeless. His office, his meetings, his business, none of it mattered. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at reports that had once commanded his full attention. His mind kept drifting, his chest aching with something unfamiliar, regret, longing. So he did something he never thought he'd do. He chased after her. The rain poured relentlessly as he drove through the city, his grip tightening on the wheel with every mile. He had always been the man people chased, the one who dictated the rules. But Sophie Carter had rewritten them all. And if chasing her meant admitting that he needed her, then so be it. Sophie was at her gallery, closing up for the night, when she heard a knock. The sound startled her, echoing through the quiet space. She hesitated, wiping her hands on a rag before making her way to the door. When she opened it, she froze. Ethan stood there, rain-soaked, his hair dripping, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "I love you," he said, his voice rough, unsteady. Sophie's lips parted, her breath catching. "Ethan?" "No." He stepped closer, his eyes dark with determination. He cupped her face, his hands warm despite the cold rain. "No more running, no more hiding. I love you, Sophie, and I don't care what anyone thinks." Tears filled her eyes, her throat tightening. She had dreamed of these words, but she had never thought he would say them. Never thought he would let himself. "You mean that?" she whispered, searching his face. He nodded, his grip on her firm, unwavering. "You broke all my rules, Sophie Carter, and I don't want to fix them." A slow smile spread across her lips, even as a tear slipped down her cheek. "Good," she murmured. And when he kissed her, it wasn't just a kiss, it was a promise, a vow sealed between them, unbreakable and absolute, a promise that this time love would win.